Are you feeling anxious, overwhelmed, and disenchanted by life, the universe, and everything? Maybe you're frustrated with the talking heads who say one thing and do something completely different. Yeah, me too. Welcome to People Watching, a podcast where we figure out what it looks like to become the role model we've always wanted by talking with real people who found real role models in their own lives. Together, we cut through all the noise and identify better sources of hope, creativity, and wisdom as we explore how we learn to make decisions about the kind of life we want to live. So join us. Let's do some people watching. This is your host, Megan J. Robinson. My guest today is Rachel Hastings. I've known Rachel for almost 10 years now, ever since we started working together in 2015. Getting to know each other through different seasons of life has built a cherished friendship that continues to evolve. As in every conversation I have with Rachel, we cover a lot of ground, from parenting to the American Evangelical Church, to what it means to stay true to self, even while inhabiting so many different roles in life. The themes of self-awareness and self-interrogation came up over and over again throughout our conversation, and I'm going to be thinking a lot about how that posture and practice shows up, not just in my own life, but in others' lives as well. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Welcome to part 1 of our conversation. We're in the studio. Welcome to People Watching, Rachel.
Hello.
So as we get started, one of the things that I would love to do is just kind of share some of the expectations and the guides around our conversation for us, for our listeners. That is how we're going to show up for each other on this conversation and how we're going to show up for the listeners. So, Rachel, would you like to start us off reading those?
Absolutely. The first one is whatever we share is by invitation, not obligation. If either of us is not comfortable pursuing a topic, let's just say, I'd prefer not to share. Thank you.
Awesome. And also, silence is a partner in our conversation. So we can feel free to take a moment to reflect without immediately filling the space with words. And this also can leave room for our inner teacher to whisper to us as well.
The next rule is be present as fully as possible. This is a space to acknowledge our doubts, fears, and failings as much as it is a space to share our joys, convictions, and successes.
Absolutely. And finally, we can ask open, honest questions. Because if we're not sure what the other person meant by the question or the statement, ask. It gives us the chance to clarify or rephrase. And also, we can ask questions that we genuinely don't know the answer to. Surprise is a great catalyst of insight. All right, awesome. So, Rachel, you and I have known each other for a long time, so we're just going to jump in and get started. And I'm super curious because I expect there are going to be things that I never knew about you. So I would just love to hear a little bit.
We will see. We will see.
Your life. I mean, we've been in the trenches together, so, we've learned a lot. But I would love to hear a little bit about your life journey. Like, what, when you look back at your life so far, like, what are the things that stand out for you that have meaning, that have helped bring you to who you are and where you are today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think along the way, I have seen doors open up for me, perhaps that I didn't anticipate opening up for me, and then kind of just going through those doors has kind of been the next thing that's led to the next thing. But I think for me, a lot of my path has been sort of the reaction to rejection in many ways, and also acceptance as well. It's like where acceptance has been, I've moved, and I think where I've been rejected, I've found somewhere else to go. So I can think back of like, you know, mentors and people that have been in my life who've really believed in me and believed in like the version of me. And in many ways, Megan, I think you were one of those people for me when I was at Gordon Conwell and working there. Is, you know, you were somebody who believed in the version of me that felt truest of me, if that makes sense. I didn't feel like I had to mask in ways that like were socially acceptable in other contexts that I was in. I could kind of bring my full self, all aspects, whether I was a worker or a mom or just like in a sassy mood or whatever. All of that was totally fine. So and I've had other people in my life like that. I had a mentor in college who was a lot like that and really encouraged me to lean into who I am. And then I think when doing that, inevitably there's other people that are just not super into that, which is fine. There's been jobs I've applied to, especially I think in church contexts for me, certain ways that I had to present or show up. Um, that were most natural to me were kind of not super appreciated. And so I think those decisions or those experiences where it was like, oh, you know, Rachel, you're too intellectual, or like you're worried too much, or like you just need to have more faith. There's a lot of things about it. You know, if we get into these, I don't know, but like they're core to who I am, and that I'm really good at. And I felt a lot of times in especially church context, I was just gaslit the entire time that those things were deficiencies about who I am. And like now I get paid to use them. So it's like I'm totally validated at this point. That those are indeed not deficiencies. They just made people in those contexts feel super uncomfortable and I didn't know what to do with them. And that's fine. There's a lot of people that work in ministry that just aren't adequately trained in how to deal with people that are different than them. They're really good at mobilizing and absorbing people into sameness, but a lot of people in ministry, especially the context I were in, were not comfortable dealing with people that were different. And so, especially women, that's like a whole nother thing. But so, and with all that to say, like I think the rejection that I felt in church, to use my gifts and then to kind of go, okay, fine, if you don't want that, I'm going to go somewhere else. And I kind of went into you know, theological education spaces and did my thing there. And I was like, oh my gosh, like people actually care that I'm like concerned that something's going to go wrong, and they are actually coming to me and asking me like, hey Rachel, tell me like what could go wrong in this situation, and then they're like value my how weird. And then like even more so, and now obviously I work in publishing, I work in academic publishing. I'm assistant academic editorial director, which is just a fancy way of saying I help run the academic imprint right now at IVP Academic. And I get to think about those things all the time, and people really appreciate my opinion at my jobs. and my and the friend group that I've cultivated over the years, now you included, like I think appreciate those things about me, and they're the people that are in my inner circle. So
I'd like to circle back around to what you were saying about like when you look back on your path, you see a lot of closed doors and open doors. And what made you keep going? You know what I mean? Like, what was it about, like, your family, your environment? I, because there's extrinsic motivation and there's intrinsic motivation. And so I feel like you have a lot of intrinsic motivation. And so I'm just curious, like, what that looked like for you, how you kind of nurtured that. Like, unpack this.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm a good little millennial, and a lot of extrinsic motivation is a motivating factor for me. Like, you can give me the grades and the sort of accolades and the participation trophy, and I'm going to feel super motivated. But like all that literally in every like level of my life ended up getting stripped away, I think. And so intrinsic motivation was all I had. Um, to the point, man, how do I even begin to think to like articulate this? I think if I were to explain it, when you graduate from college in 2008 and you grew up in a world where everybody's like, you can be whatever you want to be, and then you feel like gaslit later on, and people are like, oh, it's 2008, like, a financial crisis wasn't that big a deal, and you're like, well, actually, I was like underpaid and underemployed for a long time in my life. And then like layer that on top of the fact that like I was a good little evangelical wife for a long time. So obviously, when it came to my career and things like that, I wasn't really supposed to care a lot about that. And I still feel that pressure from people in my life, right? Who, whether they mean to or not, communicate that my highest calling is a mom, and everything else is sort of ancillary to who I am. And it's weird because I'm like, but it's not ancillary to who I am. Like, I'm literally all these things at the same time. Can we just hold this tinged in reality? And sometimes, it can feel really dismissive, but I think at the end of all of that, like where I ended up, or like how that motion stayed with me, like one, um I'm real stubborn, I think. That there's that. But also too, um,
Attest to this.
yeah, I mean, I just, I think people know I have big feelings about things. And and it's hard once I kind of hyper fixate on something to let go. I kind of am like a dog with a bone, and I'm going to be there until I'm satisfied. And that being there till I was satisfied for me was, maybe I can weave kind of three different layers to this. One, I think, was sort of my own internal inclinations about what it meant to be the kind of person that God had called me to be. And what he had called the church to be. And I was in a context when I first got married that was like kind of fundamentally opposed to what I and my gut thought things should be. But I had no allies, to the extent that like, and we're on the same page now, but like to the extent that even my husband was not my ally. And like I would ask him when we first got married, like, well, I just don't know if this model like works. I just don't know if this is really the way. Like, I see like problems with this, like not just theologically, like I'm not trying to nitpick here, but like there are actual ramifications for the formation of the people of God when we do things this way. And like the response, I just remember, and I, for those who don't know, who aren't listening, like I got married, and then 10 days after that, I went to a big church network conference. I won't name the network. I'm sure people could figure out if they want to. And then 10 days after that, I moved to South Africa with my suitcases. Like, I had nothing. I had no friends there. I had to rebuild my life again. And all I had was my husband, and sort of that over reliance on my husband and his family. Like, I had no network of people. And looking back, like I barely knew who I was at that point, but I did have a thing in me, I think, that was true to what I believed and what I'd studied and what I'd spent my time of what it meant to be the kind of person that was congruent inside and out, and what kind of people God was calling us to be. And there were real fundamental flaws to me about the model that I would ask. And I remember asking my husband, sitting there in South Africa, and saying, like, I don't know if I agree with this. Here's what I think is a problem. He's like, well, you just don't understand because you haven't been doing this as long as like I have, and like other people that are doing this with me have done. And I remember thinking, okay, I have a choice now, right? Like, I can bide my time, because I can't fight this. It's just me, right? Like, I can't fight this. I can bide my time, and kind of get on board as best I can, or I can keep fighting alone. And so I was like, I'm going to bide my time. And that's what I did. That's what I did for a lot of years. And I was a pastor's wife for 12 years. And kind of served faithfully because I loved my husband and I loved my family and I believed in my husband. So where I'm kind of going with this is that I think for me, maybe an extrinsic factor that has sort of shaped this stuff for me is my love for my husband, and my love for my family. So we were so fast forward a little bit, we were after that church, we were in a different church, very similar kind of. This is in my, just to give readers some or listeners some handholds. Like, I was in a non-denominational context throughout my entire time. And non-denominational world, as many will hear me say over and over again, it's kind of like the wild, wild west. Like, you just don't know what you're going to get. It can be anything it wants to be, right? Some of them are great. Some of them are not so great. And I've had a variety of experiences in those spaces. I feel like I'm a great critic of them because I care about the well-being of the people in there. I think that's kind of critique. And I was there for a really long time. And I really care about a lot of people that are in those spaces. But when we were at another church, that was there was some, I'll put it this way, there were some relational issues there with my husband and some other people in leadership there. But that being said, there were some issues. And I remember we were basically put in a situation where it was like, let's talk about what your exit strategy is going to be. And I remember thinking, I want to do the right thing. Like, I want to be the kind of person that, like, kind of person I believed I was supposed to be in my 20s, where I like made decisions on principle. And then when you come face to face with that kind of decision where you're young and you're listening to those kinds of words and you're like, can I really make the kind of decision that I need to make that's right and principled and good no matter what? And when I was honest with myself, I was like, no, not when the extrinsic thing that's being dangled in front of me is the well-being of my kids. I can't. And you could say, oh, that just makes you a woman of little faith. But I like to think that I just did the ruthless self-interrogation that was necessary at that age. And I'm being honest with myself, right? Like, I had kids and I didn't know what to do. And it was probably one of the scariest situations that I've ever been in to think to myself, like, well, like, are we gonna have be able to feed our family? Like, I don't know. I don't know what this means. Like, what is an exit strategy? What does that mean? Like, um, and so I made a vow with myself. Again, I'm stubborn. Like, I was just like, I'm never, ever, if my husband's gonna be in ministry, I'm never, ever gonna make him be in that position again. Where he has to choose between his principles and our livelihood. And a lot of that was the motivation for me to say, I'm gonna go work full time. That's kind of when I moved when we were at Gordon Conwell from part-time to full-time. And that really, with that experience, my 2 master's degrees that kind of were coming together at that moment, moved me into a position where I was able to do a shift into publishing after that. And it just kind of all came together. And I think, looking back, I think God looks at that and he doesn't say, oh, Rachel, like, so what was the factor? Was it like, I don't really, being a career woman's more exciting than being a mom? No, that wasn't it at all. The real motivating factor was that when I was honest with myself and I looked at like what the system was going to do to my husband and to me, it was going to chew us up and it was going to spit us back out. I was like, I never want him to be in that situation again. So that anytime he wants to walk away from ministry, that option's always on the table because there's another source of income coming in. There's a back door, basically. I want to build my own back door. And that's what I did. And every step since I decided to do that, God has opened up the door for me to do that. So you could say I'm a grumpy, rebellious Jezebel, or you could say God opened the doors for me because now I am working at a great job with great people and get to read great books that shape the church every day.
Geez, there's like 2 or 3 threads that I want to pull on here.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm everywhere, Megan. You know me.
um, there's the thread of just frustration and anger and disappointment and grief that the shape of American evangelicalism and non-denominational and professional ministry within that context forces you to have this kind of a conversation with yourself, with your family, with God, with your faith. It forces you to think, like, what stands out to me is I made myself a back door. And my thought to that in that moment was, damn, why is that? Why was that necessary? So
Mm.
that's one thread. And then the other thread is also because I know this was a conversation that was going on, and you shifting from academic into the publishing, and this is a conversation we've
Mm.
had, is you had gone into your master's degrees with the intention, both you and your husband, of going for
Yeah.
PhDs and of
Mm-hmm.
working in the academic sphere, pursuing the traditional academic professorship, teaching, writing, research, all of that.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what changed with your husband's story. I know a little bit about what changed, but I'd love to kind of explore that a little bit, um, and what that looked like for you in
Mm.
letting go of what was a big motivation for a long time.
Yeah, watching a dream die. That's really painful. We've had a few of those.
Right?
Um, and I think it goes back to like even watching my husband and me in ministry. I think there's things that the system wants from the kind of people that it hires full time that like wasn't fundamentally who we were. And that's hard once you realize that. It's like you realize you're not a good fit for something because the things that you're really passionate about, nobody really wants to pay you for. Um, and that's hard. And I think the academy is very similar. Like we know, Megan, you and I have talked tons. This could be a whole nother, train of thought. Is like theological is something I think about all the time. I talk about how publishing, theological education, in the church are all in an ecosystem together, and you can't ignore what's going on in one, and just sort of like cloister yourself off in the other. All three of these things matter, and sort of like the current landscape in which I think personally that we find ourselves is the direct effect of these three things not talking to each other. Um and and that and when we sit and people have these conferences wherever all these faculty and scholars are coming and they're shocked about the quote state of evangelicalism, and I'm like, how are you shocked? If you literally talked to anybody in the church, you would have seen this coming a mile away. And I think most pastors who are fully engaged with their congregation see that, right? But this is the problem. And we really wanted to, go do PhD work, and we're really passionate about it. We're really passionate about being like the bridge between the academy and the church. This is something that we felt like we were gifted at, we could do. And after working in theological education, I actually find a lot of enjoyment of doing cross-departmental collaboration. It's something that's sort of a feature of who I am. I'm not a siloed worker. Get me in a planning meeting and your girl's like happy as a clam, right? Like, this about me. And so I'm kind of built for that. Like I'm built for the politicking. I'm built for the alliances that must be made in order to move things forward. Like it's fun. It's like kind of a little bit of a game, right? Um, and I think I would have thrived, right, in the academy for all the things that the true purists who are academics are like, oh, like I just want to read a book. Like I hate that I have to go to a meeting. I would have been like, I'll plan the meeting for you. Like I love that stuff. I feel like being a dean would have been my second, like in a different world, in a different time. Had I been born 30 years earlier, maybe not because I'm a woman, but I think the time, unfortunately, is probably past for me on that. And I realize I can do a lot of the things that I really love, in a way that supports the unique space that I'm in. I have three kids, um, 13, almost 14, 11, almost 12, and 8. So, I know. So I'm busy.
When you announced that you
I
were
know.
pregnant with the now 8-year-old,
I
and
know.
that was another thing that was like in the midst of us working in admissions, building up admissions, you working on your degrees, working all this stuff, and you came in, you're like,
I know. I was like, I gotta tell you something. I'm pregnant.
Um, this will.
Bless that little boy. I know. And I worked all through that pregnancy. That was really hard. I was in seminary doing courses, and all kinds of things were just absolutely falling apart at church that I won't get into here. But yeah, it was an actual nightmare
Yeah.
um
I
in
just
that
remember
sense. But I
you
named
had morning sickness coming in, and you would come in, and
oh,
I would just literally pull the trash can out and set it by my desk
it
just in case
was
I needed it.
it was awful. But I will say we named, I was being pregnant. I don't think enough women talk about this in evangelical world because children are a gift. And this kind of connects back to what you were talking about earlier, where it's like my anger and my grief um and all of that. And I remember, I think a lot of times when people have engaged with me, and I'm not saying that it's been easy, so I apologize for those who were in the wake of my anger and grief, but I don't actually regret living into that anger and grief, because it really forced me to think about things constructively. Like, okay, well, if you're angry about this, how would you do it better? How would you be a better person? If you are really angry about the way this person treated you, or the way this person ran this ministry, or the way this person hid themselves from the world, how are you going to do it differently? And I think when you resolve that stuff too quickly, um, you don't actually you don't actually learn from it. It's just another form of hiding, right? And when I was pregnant with my third child, I was like ready. Like, I had given myself to Jesus. Like, we were going to go and like do all the stuff and like teach theological education. Like, and then I remember I was like studying downstairs, and I was like doing my Hebrew verb paradigms, prepping for the new semester so I could be ahead, because I was your girl that always took like the off semester and would read like 50% of the reading list, so I was like ahead. And I was taking theology 2 and Hebrew 2 and exegesis of Romans, and I was like, I'm gonna kill this semester. And then I was like, wait a second, when's the last time I had my period? And then I like was like, oh no, it's been a really long time. And I rushed upstairs. I had like one pregnancy test, and I peed on a pregnancy test, and I was like late at night. It was like 1 a.m, right? Like, and I looked at it, and it was like immediately 2 lines. And I was devastated. I was devastated because it was like, I made this agreement, God. Like, I said we were going to do this, right? And we were going to do it this way. And then, like, within 2 weeks, everything was undercut. And you might look at that and be like, well, that was selfish or immature or whatever. And perhaps it was, but how would I be where I am today if I didn't move through those emotions instead of like shaming myself for having those emotions, right? Like, I love my son. We named him Asher. It means happy and blessed. And there was a lot of really crappy things that happened that year that were not happy and were not blessings. But that boy was a blessing. And yeah, I think that part of a feature of who I've always been is like, I have allowed myself to be angry about stuff, but I've let that anger fuel a lot of my formation, honestly.
Yeah, yeah. I know writer David White has this book called Consolations, and he kind of is like defining different words that have maybe in some senses lost meaning or obscured meaning, and anger is one of them. And he talks about how anger is actually like this deep grief at what's gone at the things that have gone on. You know, it's like if depression is also anger turned inwards on yourself,
Yeah.
it, anger is also this grief. It's it's when you get to the bottom of what your expectations of what reality were going to be, you know, and it in a sense burns away all of those expectations. It burns away your the way things ought to be.
Yeah.
And I think that was, I think for me, just from my own personal experience, anger is the hardest emotion for me to tap into. It's the hardest one for me to admit that I experience.
Mm.
Um, because as an Enneagram heart type, anger to me risks destroying a connection with another person. Um,
Mm, mm.
and so for me, my first frame is always anger is a negative thing. Anger is destructive.
Yeah.
But there is, but it, I think thinking more like what David White said, what you've been saying, anger also it's like fire. It has illuminating and purifying properties, right? It can destroy,
Yes.
but it also clears the ground.
Yes. Yes. And I think that like I think you're exactly right. And I don't actually know I as you're saying this, it's like, why don't we talk about this more in church spaces? Why don't we talk about anger in terms of justice, which I think is an important aspect of this, but anger as sort of a motivator, anger, I think the other reason as an Enneagram 6 myself, like anger and fear, I think, are also very interconnected. So I think anger is one of the ways that I deal with some of the things that I fear because yeah, when I've some of the anger that I felt over the incongruity of people in my life. Like, how can you be, we all know the stories, the pastors that fell from grace, like, and for every big, I think I'll just leave it at this, for every big pastor that we know who's fallen from grace, like, I've experienced that and more from no-name pastors that nobody will ever know who have fallen from grace. And I think the anger of that feels like a massive betrayal. But the other flip side of that is the fear of like, how am I different from this person? Am I different from this person? And am I making the same kind of bargains with my soul that they are? Because I do think a lot of this is about the falls from grace, and we can talk about this more if this is something that obviously this is a huge, you talk about intrinsic factors, like I call them like the haunting questions that just never go away, and that's just been the question for me that never has gone away, as I've just watched in my own personal life, person after person after person um have one persona that they're projecting to the world, and their inner life is completely different. And so many people are hurt, and that the system, the churches, right, kind of, they there's a feature, not a bug, that these people are the ones that get the jobs and are the most charismatic and whatever. So I think one of my intrinsic factors, right, is my own fear. Well, what if I'm like that?
Yeah,
Why am I not like that? Or
yeah.
am I like that? I'm just not cool enough yet in evangelicalism for the, you know, for the system to eat me alive. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I think the question, if using economic language, it's what are the incentives for people to make those bargains in that
Yeah.
context? Like you were saying, am I like those people? These people have one persona in this context and a completely different persona in another context. And there is some amount of adjusting or toggling. You perform a little differently in a professional context than you do in your home. That's normal.
Yeah.
That's
That's
appropriate.
normal.
But we're talking about the person who has authentic, vulnerable, deeply humble. They perform these things very, very well. And then in the staff meeting, they are the complete opposite. They're a dictator, they're arrogant, they're narcissistic, whatever the black and white, the mask,
Yeah.
unmask, which is.
Yeah.
And, it's, what are the incentives for that? Like, why does that get rewarded? And what is it feeding in the context of what we're talking about in churches, for example? I mean, because we could talk about this in business, but you can understand why it happens in
Yeah.
business. It breaks in profit. It increases stock for shareholders, whatever you want to say. In the church context, what does that look like? Um, to why does that get incentivized?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I don't have all the answers, but I do think the system is set up that it's like no one should be shocked at this point. A famous evangelical scholar said when all the stuff started with the Houston Chronicle, he was shocked, he wrote in his blog, because it's something to the extent of, and you don't quote me on this, but it was something along the lines of like, I thought this could only happen in the Catholic Church because this was about,
Yes,
this
I
was
remember.
about not being a marriage thing. And I'm like, no, like this is never, if that's what you thought, you were so off the whole time. Because I think those of us who are students of this really, and who have nothing to gain in this, right? Like I'm not, and I won't say I'm not, I don't want to be like, to like refer to Zygmunt Bauman. Like, I'm not going to say like, oh, I'm just the person, I'm so removed from this whole thing. No, I'm very aware that I'm in it and a gatekeeper at this point in life. So I don't want to minimize that at all and be like, oh, I'm just the person that pulled the trigger, I didn't make the decision, kind of thing. I do own the fact that I'm now part of this system. Very conscious of that. It keeps me up at night. What does it mean to be complicit in a system that you have like fundamental fears about, in terms of like, is it doing more harm than good? What actually is the church? Like, I don't think that like the people of God and the institutions that exist in America as we see today, the Venn diagram is not a circle, right? It's not, they're not the same thing. There is overlap, but they're not the same thing. And we are delusional, I think, to think that they are. So I think this sort of stuff happens for a few reasons. One is at a macro level, the system itself is set up in a way that it does reward things that generate money.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if you're flashy and entertaining and or is for your intended audience, right? What's flashy and entertaining for people that like, you know, a certain kind of church is different than what's flashy and entertaining. The big Baptist church down the street that has a hellfire and brimstone preacher is attractive to a certain audience in a different kind of way that the, Hillsong, really high production value church is attractive to people.
Emotional, very, very singy,
Yeah.
emotional. Yes, yes, yes.
There's an intended audience for both of those, right? And the people that are like the best, oh, they're such a good preacher, it was such a good, the music is so good. If there's something that hits for people, right? And that's what gets rewarded because that's where the money goes in. And when the money goes in there, the system continues to reward that kind of behavior. It's not particularly interested in like, did you spend time and ask your children like how they were that day? Did you like show up at your kid's soccer game? They don't care. The system does not care about that. Nobody is showing up at church and being like, I'm going to this church because I know this pastor is a Cub Scout leader and cares about kids in the neighborhood. Like, nobody's doing that, right? If we lived in a place where that's what people did and they rewarded pastors who were like, I am rewarding this. I want to be under this pastor's teaching because he spends 5 hours a day praying, and that's important to me. And then another person said, well, I'm going to go to this one over here because this one does overseas missions and donates X amount of his no, like literally everything that we are attracted to, when you really start to get under the surface, has nothing to do with what we talk about, what it means to be the kind of person who's like sold out to Jesus.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
it.
no.
Right. Well, and this goes back to this whole conversation about building myself a back door. Is I don't think the system is very helpful. Part of the problem, I think, with church spaces is like it's not very helpful or compassionate for helping people who start to realize that they are not well. They're not qualified anymore. Things are not well in their life. They don't know how to extract themselves from it. It's very hard. But the problem is when they stay in there, they are hurting. They are causing a lot of hurt in the wake of their hurt. And part of being a leader is, I think, taking responsibility for your limitations and taking responsibility when you are unable to show up. And, that I think on a micro level, that looks like coming in, when I work with my people, I try to apologize if I'm not showing up well. I try to be honest about where I am. Like, hey, I feel like I'm at capacity right now. I just want to know, like, my bandwidth. I want you to know my bandwidth is low. That doesn't mean you're a weak leader. It means you're an honest leader about where you are. And I think if you do those kinds of small deposits and keep close accounts, that's like one way you can kind of subvert that. But at a larger level, and I ask myself this all the time as somebody who works in publishing, like, if I see this as a spiritual responsibility to be working at, almost every day, I look and I say, am I the kind of person, because there's a million people that could take my job today who would be just as effective and just as qualified as I am to do it. And I ask myself every day, like, am I the kind of person who can steward this job well? Because there's a lot riding on it, right? There's a lot riding on the fact. And what if I can't? And I have to face that. I think it's my responsibility, as an assistant director of an entire imprint of a pretty significant evangelical publisher in the country. It's my job to look every day and say, what if I couldn't steward that? What would I do? Do I have people I could go to? Can I go to my boss and other people in the company and say, I'm not well right now? What would we do? And I think we do have a plan if that were the case. And I think there's a plan if other people came to me and said the same thing. But then larger than that, it's like, if I realize I crossed that threshold where I'm like, I need to leave somewhere, could I do that? And the answer right now is yes. We've put in things, and my husband and I have these conversations, like, if you ever needed to leave, you could leave, right? And that was what I did for him when it was very clear that he had crossed the threshold where he was done. He was done with ministry for that season of life, paid ministry. We were both very active in ministry now, and we love it. But I was that back door for him, right? Like, I was the way that he was able to leave on his terms. And that was really important to us. Is like, it is very easy to get yourself into a situation in a church and where you're getting, you're called by God and everyone's excited about you, and everything's spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. And then you realize you're not well. And by the time you realize you're not well, you're not set up to extract yourself. You have to think about these kinds of things before you get to that point. Because then when you're starting to see those yellow flags, you can say, for the good of the people of God, I need to bow out of this paid position. I'm still part of the kingdom of God. I'm still doing the work of the church, but I'm not sitting in a seat at an organization that has a lot of power that I'm mishandling potentially.
Yeah. You've mentioned a few times, you've used the word congruity a few times, and this is something I'm thinking a lot about. And one of the things that I'm really curious about as I think about, because you mentioned congruity in the terms of the leaders and the people that you've worked with, the betrayal that you experienced in the different ministries, the different organizations that you've been in, like within your own sphere, and also just being in part in the larger spheres of evangelicalism and the world. And so you've mentioned that a few times. And one of the things that I'm really curious about is, how do we make the choices that we do based on the influence of the people around us, and or based on the roles that those people occupy in our lives? And so this is a show about the role models that we found or the role models that we've rejected. And I'm just curious, that concept of congruity. I know for you personally, I know also as an Enneagram 6, that kind of integrity and the people that you observe and that you work with is very important. But I'm just curious, let's shift the conversation a little bit into talking about, like, taking some of these threads of betrayal, of you building those back doors in your life, of who you saw and who helped you, were there at all models, or were they all counter models? People you're just like, I am going to do everything not that from now on.
And sadly, there are a lot of counter models.
Yeah.
I hate that. I think my mentor in college, Dr. Fowler, I think was one of those people who I watched live in a system that he did not agree with, um, but was able to subvert that system for a larger calling that he felt on his life. And I see a lot of parallels in the ways that I live today. But I think that means there are some things that means for your reality of how far you'll climb at organizations, most of the time. If you get to the top, if that's what you if someone like that who's subverting things gets to the top, I would say it would be by accident, not by intentionality, right?
Sure. Sure.
um I I think I as an Enneagram 6, I think was always very scared. I think I was raised to be very scared of what would happen if I said something in a way that was misunderstood. Social media certainly hasn't helped with that. Because the cancel culture conversation, I would say, well, what if I said something stupid on the internet and I was there forever in perpetuity that people could, have I said something stupid and I'm just not famous enough that anyone would ever think to go screen grab some dumb tweet that I said, 5 years ago? I don't know. But I think what I have enough experience now. I think what's sort of driven me to not contort myself, is two things. One is enough life experience now to see that the people I was contorting myself for, who were making the rules of the game, didn't know what they were talking about. My 20s, I thought the people that were in charge were the most qualified. That is not true. There are other reasons that the people that are in charge are in charge. And I think the second reason is because I have enough friends now in my life who don't care that I'm um a editor, a book editor, that I'm a gatekeeper. I have kids that will knock me down a peg anytime I'm like, I think I'm cool. They're like, you're actually not cool at all. Here's 10 reasons why. um and I have a husband, I think, who supports me in a way that like transcends what I do. Like, he doesn't care that I do what I do. And if I walked down him today and was like, I am done with all of this, he'd be like, okay. I have friends that are like that. I think if I went to you and I said, I'm done with all of this, you'd be like, okay, because those people don't care about me because of what I have to offer. There's a lot of people that like me right now. And it's not because they know me. It's just because of what I do. And I try to remember that. But the flip side of that is to remember there's also a lot of people that really like me because I'm me and not because of what I do, right? And they will be there. And the things that I've cultivated in my personal life that I love, right? Reading books for the sake of reading books, and cooking and watching scary movies, like all of that will be there for me if I walk away from all of this. And I think that the congruence is only possible when you let go of that fear. You have to let go of that fear.
It's hard. It's hard. It's hard because you are rewarded for cultivating that fear in a lot of cases.
Yep. Oh, 100%. In the academy,
Mm.
in the church, in parachurch organizations. Um, yeah, there are, um, and I think at this point it's playing that movie forward, playing that worst case scenario forward, and be getting brave about it. I mean, there's been a couple things I've done in my jobs, where I felt like it was the principled and right thing to do, and I said to myself, "What are they going to do? Fire me?" Like, oh, okay. And I think we have to be okay with that. Like, if the reaction is, what do they do? What are they going to do? Fire me for doing the right thing that I think is the right thing to do? If I'm fearful, that should signal to me, oh, I'm too attached to this thing. This is not me. This is not me.
Yeah.
In 30 years, if we're doing this podcast, I could be in a completely different place. But hopefully there's some sort of like through line that transcends what I
Yeah.
do and what church I go to and what title I have.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think about that a lot. When you and I were working together, there were, when we were able to just focus on the job, it was fine. When we had to do the job in response to economic incentives,
Oh, yeah.
it and we're back again to this tension of when you have to do certain things for money, it warps
Yep.
what those things are and what they do and what they become. And I think about that, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with money per se, but it is just in all of the environments where we have experienced the most trauma and the most harm, it has been because money, its growth and how it funds more growth has become the deciding factor, has become the defining paradigm. And I think that
Oh, yeah.
and I think, it just goes, the love of money is the root of all evil. And though we say we don't love it, we really do because of the decisions we make.
Well, and that's the weird part is I think what continues to shock me today is just how the lack of self-awareness within Christian spaces, how much money, just their lack of awareness of how much money shapes what they do. If you bring that up though, like, I mean, if I try to point this out to certain people in my life, I would get accused of like, oh, so you hate capitalism, you want to be a communist. Like, no, absolutely, that's not at all what I said. It's always so bizarre to me that we can't critique things that have a problem. Like the trying to leave the place of employment that you were before, and like there wasn't a good setup for you to do that, and like I'm very sympathetic and empathetic to the fact that like it is really really hard to do. Like it's not lost on me the level of privilege, right? Like, why can I go back to work, right? Like, well, I had 3 kids that were a certain age and they were healthy and they didn't require, there's a lot of things. I had a spouse, right? Like, there's all kinds of things that are privileges that I like totally understand. I'm not patting myself on the back like, good for me for making a backdoor. I'm so smart. It's more like, um, we need to do this better for people. We need to do this better to help empower people to do this better, because when we look, if we're really honest with ourselves about how much money shapes our ministry, the motivations for our ministries, the way boards can dangle money and donations over the head of institutions and threaten faculty happens all the time. The way that the biggest donors at churches can shape things, the way that raises at work are shaped or not shaped, the ways that or leadership teams decide to uh disseminate money amongst an organization, right? All these things shape, all these things are choices that we're making, whether they're conscious or unconscious. And
Yeah.
I just think if we really believe that God is alive, and we really believe that there's a Holy Spirit that's active in contextualizing the word into the world right now, Like, why are we so satisfied with allowing capitalism to be the driver of how ministry plays out? Why are we just so settled? And the second you ask a question, everybody's like, hold on a second. You must be a communist. No, I'm actually a believer who thinks that God transcends the economic system of our day. And is there no space for theological reflection as to how we might do this better? We might try new things to take care of the people that work. That's something I'm really passionate about. Is if being a Christian organization should not be first and foremost, or I would say this, I'm not saying it should not be first and foremost, but it is more than just creating products that are Christian. If we can't create environments where the people that work there are flourishing, we're failing. We're failing. Because what does it mean? What does it mean to create a Christian song or a Christian book or a Christian, if the people inside the organization that are making those things happen are being treated like trash? And this is the question, right? Like, we have to do this stuff better. We have to ask these questions. We can't allow people to shut us down asking these questions because they're afraid we, like, I don't know, hate money or something. Like, no, I'm just not happy with letting, this is where my anger takes me. I am not happy with keeping things status quo. I am not going to be thankful for a situation or a system that is dehumanizing my fellow man. And if you're happy with that, that's on your head. But I'm not going to let that be on my head at Judgment Day.
Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss part 2 of this conversation. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I hope you found something that resonated with you and that helps you become more hopeful, creative, and wise in your own life. Please share this with someone who you think would love this conversation, and like, subscribe, and leave a comment or a review to boost the show. Shalom.